Alright guys, I'm going to do a short safety briefing before we start the event at 1:30. If you haven't sanitized your hands, please make sure you have sanitized your hands. Mask on at all times, even when you're speaking, except for when you're drinking or eating. Do not intermingle during your mask off. Make sure to do your safe entry check-in and complete your health declaration form if you haven't done so. Please remember to silence your phone so you don't interrupt the debate. In case of any emergency, please exit through the 2 doors behind you. We will start at 1:30 sharp. Thank you. Okay guys, before we start, we're going to take a short group photo.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Shell-NTU Inter-Varsity Energy Transition Debate Competition to those in this room and many more tuning in via YouTube. My name is Lee Ann, and I'm your host for today. After an exciting morning at the semi-finals, we will have two final teams vying to the champion. They are Team SMU and Team NUS. Let's give them a warm round of applause. Before we kick off the finals, may I invite the President of Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, Professor Subra Suresh, to give the opening remarks. Professor Suresh, over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Ms. Ah Ka Peng, Chair of Shell Companies in Singapore, Mr. Leong Wei Hung, and all the colleagues from Shell Companies here, colleagues from NTU who have worked with Shell to organize this, participants from different universities and polytechnics in Singapore, representing NTU, Singapore Management University, National University of Singapore, Nanyang Polytechnic, and Singapore Polytechnic, who are here, judges, and more than 300 people who are joining us online. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming here. This energy debate is very important for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it's not only one of the most significant topics facing humanity, that the topic of energy, sustainability, the future of the earth, many of these are interrelated. It's not only a topic facing humanity, in some cases, in some parts of the world, it also poses an existential threat. And Singapore is one of those countries where rising sea levels and energy issues and global warming, for reasons beyond our control, can have a deleterious effect on our ways of life and livelihoods. Secondly, it's a topic that's particularly relevant to the younger generation, because with every succeeding generation, the significance, impact, and consequences of the crisis are going to be more challenging. And that's particularly one of the reasons I find it very appealing to be here today, because motivating, energizing, and inspiring the younger generation, who are already very committed to this cause, will go a long way in addressing humanity's grand challenges. The third reason it's important is because of NTU's own commitment to the topic of sustainability in many different ways. Most recently, all of last year during 2020, we went through a very detailed exercise involving a large number of our stakeholders on how to galvanize the community to prepare a 5-year strategic plan that captures bold aspirations and ambitions for the university for the next stage of major growth. And NTU has had a remarkable journey in 30 short years, going from primarily a teaching university in technology to a globally acclaimed research university. So the next wave of evolution cannot be just about education, research, and innovation within the academic context, but equally it focuses on how we address Singapore's needs, regional challenges, and equally global challenges. So in our NTU 2025 strategic plan, we have articulated 4 of the grand challenges facing humanity. And first of those would be humans' interactions with the environment, our use of energy, our respect for the environment, and how we use and intentionally or unintentionally misuse and abuse the environment, our energy resources, etc. From that point of view as well, it's very timely and relevant that we launch this inaugural Shell-NTU energy transition debate across universities. It also brings together collaboration, not just within NTU, but across universities. So I really want to take this opportunity to thank Shell and all our colleagues at Shell for partnering with us, and all my colleagues in the Nanyang Business School for their leadership in organizing it with Shell. Industry partnership is extremely critical and important for us to succeed in this, along with partnership with government. Let me just conclude by making a comment about what a university can potentially do. We have so many different ways in which we can have an impact on the energy debate. One is the younger generation, which is you, the students. You are probably even more energized than previous generations in this cause because it affects you, and you are very passionate about it. And you have grown up in an environment where you are much more globally sensitized to the challenges and opportunities than previous generations because of communication tools, opportunities to travel, and the evolution of Singapore itself on the global stage. Secondly, the education, research, and innovation are our bread and butter of a university. And in all of those domains, we can further the energy debate, conversation, and potentially finding solutions with appropriate partners in a scalable way, and universities have a role to play. NTU, because of its unique history, has an added advantage, which I was talking to Ka Peng about earlier during lunch, and that is we are a 30-year-old university in its current version as NTU. We have a large and beautiful campus where already 95% of nearly 230 or so buildings on our campus are Green Mark Platinum certified. Our aspiration for the next 5 years is to make the entire campus Green Mark Platinum certified, and also have a further aspiration for the next 5 years. We will reduce our net energy consumption, net water consumption, and net waste generation by 50% by early 2026 compared to the baseline level of 2011. We are about 30% of the way through already. And this is a goal that the campus is committed to, the entire leadership team is committed to as well. If we succeed in that goal, in that ambitious goal, our next target will be net zero. And we are working very closely with various government agencies on how to connect that to the Singapore Green Plan 2030. So for all those reasons, I'm really delighted to see the students participate in this from across AUs within Singapore. I wish all the participants, first of all, I want to express my gratitude to all the participants who are here and all those who are joining us online. I wish the speakers this afternoon all the best. And once again, let me close with thanking Shell for your commitment to and partnership with, commitment to the cause and partnership with NTU. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Suresh. We released the debate motion to the final two teams before this event started. They had 30 minutes to prepare as a team. The motion that they will be debating on this afternoon is, this House believes that governments should implement more aggressive measures to incentivize the switch towards electric vehicles. I repeat, this House believes that governments should implement more aggressive measures to incentivize the switch towards electric vehicles. Proposition team is Team NUS, and opposition team is Team SMU. I wish you all the best, and let the debate begin.
order to reach the IPCC's goal of 1.5 degrees of change, it is essential that the quarter of the world's carbon emissions coming from the transport industry is reduced to net zero emissions. We think that the next generation of energy has to be clean, it has to be renewable, and it has to be net zero in terms of carbon emissions. We think the pressures like carbon change, like climate change and limited fossil fuel supply make it inevitable that this change is going to happen. Therefore, we think that this debate is not going to happen on the fringes of whether we should change or not, but rather how are we going to come about and result in these changes that allows for us to live in a sustainable environment that will last for generations to come. Therefore, we think the best way to phase in the new generation of cars that are net zero in emissions and are dependent on electrical energy that does not result in carbon emissions is only through this means of governmental support, allowing for push and pull factors to both exist for consumers and the industry as a whole to innovate and create the opportunity and economic viability of these cars to exist in the first place. Now, our policy for today is twofold. First of all, we will move this policy in tandem with renewable energy policies. For example, run things such as the building of infrastructure for power grids for electrical energy, things such as solar panels where it's suitable, wind turbines where it's suitable, geothermal or hydroelectric dams be built where it's suitable for these electrical energies to be provided to the industry in the first place. Second, we'll do things such as allow for push and pull factors, and here's the more aggressive measures to deal with the consumer industry, being, first of all, subsidizing the cost to buy electric vehicles and subsidizing the cost of these renewable sources of electricity. Second, we're also going to do things such as increase the taxes for petrol cars, petrol-based engines, and decrease the priority for car licenses for people who want to buy these cars in the first place. So, I'll talk about this debate in two main areas. First, I'll talk about why we allow electric vehicles to become economically viable as a change to what is going on in the status quo. And second, how we deal with the best market for change, for example, dealing with things such as air pollution. So this first idea of allowing electric vehicles to become economically viable, we think that the status quo is one such as electric cars are marketed as a luxury good. They are not currently economically viable for the average consumer on the ground. This means buying a Tesla is not something that you and your friends and family are likely to consider in the status quo because it's prohibitively extremely expensive, right? So we think that the current marketing surrounding electric cars is one that doesn't allow for the common population to buy them. We think that them being sold as a luxury is something that companies want in the first place, right? Companies such as Tesla make extremely high amounts of profit at a point which they are able to make less cars for higher amounts of profit margin, and therefore they want to keep it this way. We think that these incentive structures is one that is particularly bad for the environment because it is difficult for people on the ground to buy these same cars that are particularly a good opportunity for people to move towards a net zero emissions world. We think that it's necessary for more of these cars to exist in order for us to move towards this net zero emission goal in the first place, right? Because we think that it's more profitable for these companies to continue as they have been operating in status quo, the incentive for them to change as a result is extremely difficult. Here is where the government comes in, right? We think that because it's incredibly difficult to push these things without governmental support, because of things like access to structures like electrical charging ports for these cars, the structure for the batteries that these cars run on means that this policy is able to effectuate change in two ways. First, the supported push to address the cost-benefit analysis of consumers means that electric vehicles would very effectively benefit from things such as economies of scale towards the market, right? We think that this looks like things such as building infrastructure for electrical grids for people to access the charging ports towards their cars, and being able to do competitive research and development towards the competitive development of these technologies, right? We think that holding on to green patents is something that Tesla has been exclusively trying to do, but we don't think that this is something that is conducive for our goal of net zero emissions, right? So what do we do on our end? We think that we increase the consumer uptake at a point which that these things become more accessible. At a point which the government starts to subsidize things such as Tesla, the kind of good that Tesla cars become, or electrical cars in general become, they become a normal good rather than one that's a luxury good. Meaning that the cost-benefit analysis towards average consumers on the ground looks something more like this. If I need a new car, I might consider an electrical car rather than that of a petrol-based car, because now it is comparatively cheaper for me to buy this electrical car as compared to the old world where we used to buy petroleum-based cars. Now, second, we think that we allow for organic change to happen at a consumer level. We realize that demand for transport systems is inflexible because people are always going to need cars. They are always going to need to go to work. They are always going to need a more effective means of transport rather than just walking, right? But we think that there's no incentive for the poor to suddenly throw out their existing cars because of diminishing marginal utility, meaning that we're not suddenly going to result in more people buying a second car. What the change is going to do here is that at a point which somebody needs a new car to replace their old one, or if someone needs a new car for because they have a new family and new people to transport, we think that the car that they are more likely going to consider is therefore going to be an electrical car at a point at which that the cost for these cars themselves and the accessibility to charging these cars become far more accessible, meaning that you have more electric cars and a new generation of people moving towards these electric cars as older petroleum cars grow to the end of their mileage lifespan, right? Okay, moving on to my second idea on why is this particularly good for the environment. Because we think we reduce things such as air pollution in countries like China, we regard these air pollution results as externalities because the public has no ability to take control over them and see themselves as generally helpless against these things. We think that the phasing out of petroleum vehicles will be able to directly deal with these problems, especially in big cities where massive air pollution exists, right? For example, Beijing and for example in Delhi, right? We think that in these areas, at a point which you are able to phase out these cars, you are able to slowly lessen the amount of pollution that these countries deal with and creating a better sense of lifestyle for these people in these areas. We think that at the end of the day, the question is not whether a transition is going to happen, it is. But do we want to be unprepared when it happens? We think that humans should not go gentle into that good night. We're very proud to propose. Thank you.
Okay, I thank the first proposition speaker for their speech. May I now call upon the first opposition speaker to open a case for opposition.
Speaker, there are three things that I want to cover in this speech. One, what are the environmental harms of government's policy? Two, why this impacts the poor the most and why the poor are the most important group of people we have to think about. And three, why a gradual shift towards electrical vehicles is way better for the environment and the economy. But before I move on, let me just state out front. Yes, we agree that I think for both sides of the house, the outcome we both want is to promote the switch to EV, but the way the switch is carried out is the way we contend on. So for our side of the world, what does a policy look like? Our policy is to stick to the status quo. We neither discourage nor encourage EV. We believe that we should be neutral on this front. Number two, we are happy to stand for other ways to combat climate change. For example, reducing industrial pollution, increasing the rate of recycling, so on and so forth. Thirdly, we are happy to stand for electrical vehicles, but we believe that the switch to electrical vehicles should be a gradual and organic movement. So before I move on, let me just talk about government's policy, right? I think government characterization of aggressive measures is not really accurate. So what does aggressive actually mean, right? Aggressive means that you want to increase the uptake of electric vehicles significantly in 1 to 2 years That is what we are looking at. So you want the proportion of electric vehicles in countries to increase significantly. And that is what aggressive measures, that is what aggressive change look like. Yep. So it is not organic at all. It is inorganic. It is an artificial change. So what are the harms of government's policy? There are two main harms to this. The first one is environmental harms, which I shall now touch on. There are three subpoints to this. So firstly, for any EV switch to be sustainable, it means that your infrastructure must be there. But on government side of the house, where the switch is so aggressive, it means your infrastructure is unable to catch up fast enough. You're unable to roll out charging stations. You're unable to roll out like your clean energy sources. So your infrastructure is unable to catch up. And not only that, the range of electric vehicles available to consumers is very limited. And the implication of this is that it turns people away from considering EV because it is neither convenient for them, it is not convenient for them, and in fact, there is more problem for them. Imagine you driving out one day, right, and you can't charge your car because there's not enough charging stations out there. What do you do with a car? Do you just leave it on the road? Yeah, that's the kind of problems that we are looking at. Second, moving on to my second point, is that electric vehicle is not the be-all and end-all. So at the moment, electric vehicles are mostly powered by coal, right? This is a carbon-intensive industry. So on one hand, so we see that on government side of the house, even though you promote EV, you are not reducing carbon emissions because ultimately you're still resorting to traditional power plants. You have to fire up traditional coal plants that are still that are very that have significant carbon emissions. So government claim that maybe you can power this with like wind energy, solar energy, renewable energy, right? But I will now refute that point, which is that it is unable to rely on renewable energy at a point right now. And we know that this is because renewable energy is still in its nascency. And for example, solar energy, right? You can't rely on solar energy because there's still so many problems, right? So just take a look at the weather right now. It's so volatile, right? There's no constant supply of sunlight. So imagine one day you can't rely on solar energy anymore because like of these changes. So there's still a lot of problems with this. So moving on to the third point is that technology is not developed. Current electric vehicles are not efficient enough, and there's also a lot of problems with this. So for example, your lithium-ion batteries, they are still not well developed enough. And what is the implication of this? So lithium-ion is used in the making of bombs, right? This is how dangerous it can be. And if these materials are not disposed properly, and there is no infrastructure in place to dispose this properly, there will be significant pollution effects. So you pollute the soil, there's a lot of environmental degradation. So to sum up, so not only does EV, even if you rely on EV, right, there's still pollution. And if you adopt aggressive adoption, there'll be significantly more pollution because of the undeveloped technologies. Yes?
Your side stated end goal is to transition to EVs in the long term. Given that your policy is to maintain the status quo, how do you incentivize this switch in the long term on your side of the house?
Yep, I'll touch on that. Thank you. So moving on to my second argument, which is that it impacts the poor. So on government side, right, when you impose taxes on non-electric vehicles, petrol, the poor affects the most because we are looking at people who use like 1980s tractors which are running on diesel. And if you impose tax on diesel, they are the ones who are hurt the most. And these people rely on these vehicles for their livelihood. Number two, when people switch to EV, there's a drop in tax revenue. And this tax revenue, the decrease in tax revenue, means that there's less subsidies available for poor people, which means they would struggle more with education, food, shelter. All these things will be more inaccessible to them. And so we believe that the government has a principal duty towards fulfilling people's basic needs first before moving to higher order items like environmental, like your climate change. So we believe that given that this government's policy will result in more poverty, it would result in people rejecting environmentalism, When people are unable to put food on the table, they would not care about food. They would not care about climate change. And we see this in movements like Yellow Vest, where your everyday people resist such changes. And this means that if the ordinary people do not support such changes, we believe this is not sustainable in the long run. And on the other hand, on our side, on our world, transition is more sustainable. The tech will be better because there's time to do R&D, test, and conduct pilot trials. And also, transition still happens in our side. Because when people are richer, they care more about standard of living, and they will be more willing to support transition. And with all that, we are proud to oppose.
I thank the first opposition speaker for their speech. May I now call upon the second proposition speaker to continue the case for proposition.
Phenomena such as rural-urban migration and rising populations around the world means that the demand for transportation and the demand for vehicles is going to rise in the upcoming decades, regardless of what world you live in. The question in this debate, therefore, then, is insofar as that change is inevitable, how do we want to manufacture the processes and the ways in which that change will occur? Government told you that the only way that we should approach this change is to ensure that it is one that will not extremely severely debilitate the environment. That means switching to vehicles that do not have any carbon emissions because they run on electric batteries. I think the failure of opposition to engage with the necessary counterfactual and the necessary extension into the future that proposition framed this debate as has already severely undermined their case. I'm going to answer a few things coming out from the opposition. The first is this point about aggression. What does it mean to adopt extremely aggressive measures? It is true that we want to spike the uptake of electric vehicles, but what opposition neglects to understand is what is the demographic among which we are looking to spike this uptake? Obviously, we are not looking to spike this uptake among individuals in the status quo who choose to take public transportation. The reason is that transport and buying a vehicle is always prohibitively expensive and is always going to need a lot of processes. You need a license, you need to buy insurance, you need to accommodate your long-term maintenance costs for the vehicle. Therefore, the people in this debate and the stakeholders that matter are those who are going to buy a vehicle anyway, are those who are going to either one, buy a vehicle that runs on fuel or buy a vehicle that runs on an electric battery. So the point is that given the cost of vehicles that are always going to exist, our question, the frame of this point then, is what, insofar as the demand spikes regardless, what kind of a demand should we cause to spike insofar as that point is relevant? The second thing to say is about this idea of the overloading of infrastructure. Now, of course, a government is only going to encourage an uptake that it can afford. So I'm going to give an analogy here. For example, just because a country may not have the largest immediate stockpile of vaccines does not mean that it does not encourage its general population to join a vaccination drive, right? Because sometimes when we measure certain policies, if we know for sure that the outcome is good, what a government's duty is to ensure that it has the ability in the long run to afford these resources to its people, to create those positive outcomes for its people. But more importantly, note that it's only government side that actually creates any incentive and any impetus for industry leaders to start rapidly amping up their manufacturing of things like electrical grids, of the things like electrical batteries. Why? Because governments are obviously always going to have a two-way dialogue between them and the people and them and industry leaders. So obviously this debate is not just government tell people, please buy electric vehicle. This is also government telling industry leaders that, look, we are going to give the people a certain narrative. And as a result, in the next 5 years, it is almost a given that the demand of electrical vehicles is going to spike. It tells electrical manufacturers, it tells battery manufacturers that they can afford to start ramping up production of such infrastructure because the rise in demand for it is almost going to be a given. I think that fundamentally deals with their point about the infrastructural overload. And the last thing about the poor, they said that you lose money insofar as like you lose the tax revenue out of such subsidies. The first thing to say is that budget is never a zero-sum game for any government. So it's not as though if you take away money from the tax revenue if you spend money on providing subsidies to electric vehicles, that it therefore means that you cannot spend money on another resource. This is a false dichotomy because climate is an urgent issue. And there will always be alternative agendas and alternative expenditures and third-party expenditures in the government's budget from which it can take money insofar as those agendas are less urgent. So we are talking about things like the military or military campaigns or things like nationalistic endeavors that do not serve any long-term fundamental interests of the nation. So this is a question of how efficiently governments use tax revenue. It's not a question of whether or not they have enough money, right? And the extension of this point is to say, especially in regard to the poor, is that we do not severely harm them. Why? Because what opposition fails to acknowledge is that government is the only side that has any way of dealing with the huge air pollution effect that vehicles that run on fuel in a status quo cause. Insofar as we reduce these emissions for extremely population-dense states, right? Cities such as Shanghai, for example, where healthcare costs, when your respiratory conditions become so commonplace, where asthmatic conditions become so exacerbated for the poor, and they have to deal with the costs that are associated with that, that is when they are put in a situation that they cannot escape debilitating costs. And that is a situation that is created by the opposition for them. Insofar as we reduce this problem of the long-term costs that are associated with healthcare and the air pollution in general, I think we win that point as well. But before I go on, I'll take one from opposition. Okay, positive material. I'm going to posit in this house that the ideal future we envision for the world in the long run is one where the overarching structure in which transport and the supply chain of the world is established is one that is almost net zero in its emissions. So it's one where even things like ships and trains can run on electricity. We know the technology does not necessarily exist in a status quo. But what we will say is that it is worth it to create an environment, to create incentives where such technologies may one day become possible. What does proposition want to do? We want to increase the demand for electric vehicles, right? We want to give firms economies of scale so that they can step up their research into electric batteries. And we want to step up competition for such firms as well, so that, for example, Tesla and NIO will have more competition in its industry. Insofar as these two mechanisms are likely to actualize insofar as demands rise, what happens then is that proposition drives companies to try and get the first mover's advantage on revolutionary fronts in the electricity transport industry. This looks like companies now have a reason to not just, insofar as the demand and the scale for electric cars alone are feasible, companies going into the future and projecting into their future revenue are likely to look for avenues of research that will allow them to expand beyond just the market of electric cars. So it may be that one day trains and ships may run on electricity as well. But the thing is, that is never going to happen if even producing an electric car is prohibitively difficult and the profit of it is also inherently uncertain. Our supply is never going, and the point is, the demand for such transport infrastructure, the demand for shipping, the demand for as populations rise, the point is that the demand is never going to scale back. This means that insofar as the change is, as your supply chain is never going to regress in terms of its scale, the duty that governments have towards their people in the long run is to ensure that insofar as the supply chain of the world continues to expand, that it expands in an inherently sustainable manner. This means that it needs to be the case that in 30, 40, 50 years, we can create ships that can run on electricity as well. The only way that happens is that we first create a world where the technology to produce cheap electric cars that are definitely profitable is widespread and is inherent. Very proud to propose.
I thank the second proposition speaker for their speech. May I now call upon the second opposition speaker.
Hi, before I start, can I check if I can be heard? Okay. Three things in this speech. First, I want to talk about why rapid and aggressive transition will not actually reduce the carbon impact in the world today. Second, I want to talk about how this affects the poor. And third, I want to give a trade-off and explain to you why, even if the environment is affected on our side of the house, why the poor is a much more important and pressing issue we need to care about in this debate. First, about why aggressive transition will not help. Why an aggressive transition will not be one that's environmentally friendly. The importance of this argument, before I start, is that proposition hangs their case on being able to solve the environmental problem altogether. If I can disprove their environmental impact, they can have nothing to stand their case on. The observation I have with regard to a rapid and aggressive transition towards electric vehicles is two things. First, I note that at the point where we talk about a rapid and aggressive transition to electric vehicles, and note, electric vehicles are not something that you just pluck out of the end, put it into a power grid, and it can move. There are a lot of times, a lot of infrastructure that have to be built before that can actually happen. What this looks like is that we need to transition our electric power plants to a much more renewable source of energy, such as able to happen. But the problem is, a rapid and aggressive adoption means that you put necessary stress on that infrastructure to the point where it's going to be even more polluted. This looks like countries firing out old power plants, because that will mean that is what will be able to meet the demand of electric vehicles. So first and foremost, I want to prove to you that their benefit of environmental benefit does not actually materialize at the point where their benefit is contingent on an aggressive promotion of it. No thanks. But even if I concede the argument on their side, right, they are able to build that infrastructure. I posit that electric vehicles today are still in their infancy. The technology is insufficiently developed, and at the point where we aggressively encourage the adoption of it, we argue that a lot of times it's going to be way more pollutive. How does this manifest in the real world? This looks like adopting electric vehicles that are still not market ready, such that their lithium-ion batteries will literally leak to the earth 10 years after you scrap them. That is the problem they have to deal with on their side of the house. It is not just about carbon emissions we have to deal with in this debate. It is also about the other externalities, like the problems of waste pollution, like the problems of whether our infrastructure can hold this. So the upshot of this argument here is that this proven their economic environmental impact altogether. They have nothing to stand their case on. But let's just say, they argue, but we increase the economic viability of these forms of technology. Not true for two reasons. First, I acknowledge that this might allow electric vehicles to be a lot more economically viable in the short term. But the problem is that subsidies entrench the current market players. The reason why is because they say, there are things like green patents. Precisely, green patents mean that people are locked into the Tesla infrastructure, giving them market power in the long term. What this means is that the companies that are particularly aggressive in the business now, and I'll just note that currently, at this point of time, there are less than 5 viable players in the market, like Tesla, BYD, NIO, and that's about it, right? What this means is that you increase their market power significantly, such that they can jack up the prices so exorbitantly high in the future, such that electric vehicle adoption, mainstream electric vehicle adoption, becomes an impossible goal on their side of the house. So they might have a short-term win now, but I think in the long term, they're going to suffer a lot of the environmental harms because people cannot switch. But they say, but at the very least, we need to at least give them some sort of we need to give them some sort of economic viability. The problem is, at the point where we give subsidies, you also decrease the incentive for these companies to innovate as well. The reason why is because subsidies means that you don't have to innovate anymore. You can literally sell your cars off the roof because they concede, right? We increase the demand significantly. When you increase the demand significantly, you reduce innovation altogether, such that the future forms of electric vehicles that might be way, way, way more environmentally friendly can never actually materialize. All of this will happen on our side for two reasons. First, I posit and I note that there is already a gradual transitioning happening. We are talking about rise of private capital in NIO, Tesla. Just look at Tesla stocks, it's really through the moon at the moment. And I think that gradual transition will happen slowly. But second, we also see that with increased economic prosperity, people in China, for example, precisely the examples they use, are looking to electric vehicles because they now know that polluted forms of vehicles they are literally clogging up their lungs, and that's why they gradually move to it. So I don't think the counterfactual on our side is that there's no electric vehicles. The counterfactual is that we gradually transition onto it. Why is that way better? Two reasons. First, we don't place undue amounts of stress on the infrastructure such that you lead to way more environmental problems. And second, we do this in such a sustainable way such that companies cannot gain market power, pricing other people out for mainstream market adoption. That is how we win the debate. Second argument, therefore, on the poor. So I first want to note that they cannot have their cake and eat it. If they say we want to have so much infrastructure, then it necessarily means that some amount of tax revenue to the poor will be taken away from it. Why is this harmful? The reason why is because the poor are the most dependent on tax revenue. Things like infrastructure, school, universal healthcare are the kinds of things that will be cut on their side of the house, but not ours. But second, and that is if they have a lot of subsidies, right? But if they have too low subsidies, the problem is that the transition is going to be the hardest for the poor. So I note here that no matter how they do their model, if their model is huge subsidies, they hurt the poor because there's decreased tax revenue. If they give very little subsidies, then the poor will be hurt significantly as well. So I think they have to take the impact and take the hit on the argument of the poor. Now then, on the third argument, and this is the argument that really wins us around. Why is it that given that the poor is such an important issue, even if I concede, and I'm not conceding here, but even if I concede, we lose the argument on the environment, we will still win this debate? 3 reasons why. First, on a consideration of scale, poverty is a much more pressing and endemic problem that we need to solve. Environmentalism can still be mitigated in other ways. There are still talks about seawalls and things like that. I don't think it's that much of a pressing issue. We are talking about 800 million people going hungry every single day. I think governments have a duty to solve that. But second, even if, and there is a duty towards the environment, we argue that the duty to your citizens supersedes any idea of environmentalism, because people pay taxes and future generations don't. They vote, future generations don't. I think this is a necessary principle that the governments need to care about the poor more. Third, I will also argue that in terms of a hierarchy of needs, being able to fill the bellies of people, ensure economic viability of people, is a much more pressing and important issue in this debate, beyond the problems of having clean air in this debate. So the conclusion of this is that even if you adjudicate and recognize that their side wins the argument on the environment, we still win this round because we proved to you why the poor is much more pressing issue in this round. So the conclusion of my speech is as follows. First, I've disproven to you that there is environmental benefits on their case. Second, I've proven to you why this affects the poor. And third, I've proven to you why the poor is a much more important issue in this round. Proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the second opposition speaker. May I now call upon the third proposition speaker.
Can we heard? Yeah? Okay. Opposition loses this debate because the strategy is to wait and see what happens. Waiting and seeing is how we got to this stage in the first place. Because Rachel tells you that cars and electric vehicles in particular have been gate-kept as a luxury item because of the fact that we've been waiting and seeing where this technology will hit. We need change, we need it now, and therefore we will engage with our policy. 3 things. First, are electric vehicles going to be worse on their side, on our side of the house? Second, are they going to be better environmentally? And third, on helping the poor. First, on the idea of accessibility of these vehicles. Rachel tells you they are currently a luxury good. There is currently a gatekeeping of the technology needed to make these cars. Opposition fundamentally does not engage with our frame. The way that these big companies like Tesla and NIO currently engage in ensuring that other people cannot make electric vehicles is in technology gatekeeping, limiting access to what they are able to currently do by moving out vehicles into the market at a very slow pace in order to keep it as a luxury good and a luxury item. The difference on our side is very simple. Insofar as aggressive government policies will lower the barriers to entry by which it will take, for instance, to produce an electric vehicle, insofar as you can sell them for a cheaper price and still make a profit off of it, this means that you're going to force these companies to engage in price competition. Insofar as even if there are only 5 companies in the market, but there is a huge demand now for electric vehicles, you're going to necessitate forcing price competition, moving electric vehicles from being a luxury good to a normal good. So even if we concede, and we don't, that their side only has 5 people in the market, that's better than only having 1, that's better than gatekeeping electric vehicles as a whole. But given that you're also going to be lowering the barriers to entry, this means that there are more likely to be more players in the market at the point where you're able to subsidize this technology and subsidize other companies, other sustainability innovators to get into this industry to begin with. So we're going to increase our competition at the point where we have aggressive reduction of the cost in order to create an electric vehicle. But not also that their entire case is premised on this idea that there'll be a natural shift towards electric vehicles in some point of time. Number one, they don't explain to us how this natural shift occurs beyond just saying, well, it's going to happen because we all recognize environmental damages. The reality is, insofar as a petrol vehicle is still currently cheaper cheaper than an electric vehicle for most consumers out there, the next time you want to buy a car when your COE expires, you're going to buy a petrol vehicle. This is the key distinction between aggressive subsidies and not. It is when you're going to buy the next car in your line of vehicles, when you're transitioning from one car to another, what do you buy? Every little bit helps, and therefore we think aggressive subsidies are useful. The next thing they say, and this brings me on to the environment, is they say that we are harmful to the environment for 3 ways. The first way is infrastructure. This is absolutely nonsense for 2 reasons. The first is, why do you think this technology is currently in its nascency? Because of the fact that it is not a market that most people operate in, and therefore you do not have the infrastructure that you need in order to make the market stronger, insofar it's currently limited to a few players anyway. That tells you that we can preempt the need for more infrastructure by letting companies know that this is a policy that we're going to engage in the next 3 or 4 years, ensuring that you don't overload our supply chains. But even so, there are 3 things I want to point out about their policy. The first is that if these people are going to be buying a car anyway, the likelihood is that the same kind of supply chains and the same kind of resources that are needed on both sides of the house in order to make this car. The question is, at the point when you make the car, is the next 15 years that the car is on the road, is that going to be greener or not? Insofar as right now, we're able to ensure that electric vehicles do not produce the same kind of pollution that regular petrol vehicles do, we think that for a long period of time after you switch to an electric vehicle, the trade-off is that you have far better and cleaner air in the long term. Their main response to this is, oh, no. But like, right now we're still using coal, right, for electricity, so it's still going to be really bad anyway. 2 responses. The first is, at the very least, there is a potential for shifting in the short term. Insofar as electricity can be renewable, but petrol cannot, the difference here is that even if you can only have renewable power grids in 5 or 6 years' time, at the very least, when that switch occurs, we are ready for it. We are ready to transition to a carbon negative footprint. This is the key distinction between our side and theirs, that their side fails to contend with anyway. But even so, as we already said, we're going to ensure that these companies are more likely to build the infrastructure needed on our side of the house to ensure more turbochargers, more electrical power grids, insofar as more people are using electric vehicles to begin with. Therefore, when they claim to you that EVs are going to be environmentally unfriendly, I think this is a disingenuous argument, insofar as in the long term, they're probably going to be more environmentally friendly anyway, but we need to necessitate this shift today in order to ensure that in the long term, they are indeed environmentally friendly. The last thing on the poor, 3 things. The first is, let's not let them use doomsday scenarios to deal with you. They suddenly said 800 million people are going to lose their jobs and are going to die just because we place a tax on diesel. How realistic do you think that is? That insofar as just tax diesel, you're going to make 800 million people die. Clearly, they're exaggerating the effects here. So let's give you 3 comparatives that I think will win us this clash. The first is, insofar as air pollution goes down, because, your cars are not producing the sort of carbon footprint that makes air pollution a thing in nations like Delhi and China, you're going to reduce the kind of healthcare costs that a lot of these poor individuals in these countries are going to have to face when they have, for instance, breathing difficulties, lung problems, because of the pollutants in the air within these countries themselves. This is a financial cost that affects the poor the most, and insofar as it does affect the poor the most, we suggest to you that we are better on our side because our aggressive subsidies will ensure that these poor individuals do not need to pay for the kind of exorbitant healthcare costs when they get health concerns in the future from the large amount of petrol vehicles in the environment in these nations. But the second thing is this, right? If we cannot get this shift underway, if we cannot transition, and if we continue to pollute the environment the way that we currently are doing, this is going to create a massive climate refugee situation in the next 30 to 40 years' time. This looks like people in poorer regions of the world who cannot afford seawalls, who cannot build these seawalls in order to defend their own nation from rising sea levels, being forced to be climate refugees and flee to developed nations where they'll be having a far more miserable life at the point of time where you don't have the infrastructure needed to facilitate climate refugees in the first place. So even on the metric of the poor, we are better insofar as we do not let this happen, and we need to stop this from happening in order to ensure that the poor are better off on our side. Therefore, we stand on proposition.
I thank the third proposition speaker for that speech. May I now call upon the third opposition speaker?
Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah, okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. If it's inevitable, as they concede that we'll move towards a more green society, why do then they want to artificially create a form of artificial demand, when our side stand for far more sustainable adoption of those particular technology? Because make no mistakes, right? In the status quo, there's already a move towards those green transition. That's why, for instance, there's ESG funding. That's why, for instance, things like Tesla, despite making huge amount of losses, are being sustained by the private markets. There's already a move towards green society, and what we do not want is an unsustainable adoption of those particular green technology, right? So I think a lot of their benefits hinge on them proving that there's more technology improvement or innovation on their side of the house. When they didn't respond to Pearson's argument that actually these subsidies themselves actually stifles innovation, which kind of hurt all the harms they talk about on their side of the house. So I talk about two broad themes in this debate. First, I talk about the environment and why I was actually better protect the environment. Second, talk about the poor and why that's the most important stakeholder within this debate. So first, let's talk about the environment. So I will start by giving a clear example of China. So as you know, China clearly prefers their domestic brands, and oftentimes give them a lot of, for instance, things like benefits and give them a lot of priority within the market, right? But despite this, a lot of Chinese consumers still prefer to pay more for foreign brands. Why is this so? Because at the point which you allow them to have too much subsidies, for instance, they become overly reliant on those particular subsidies, and they sustain themselves through those particular subsidies and through the aggressive measures that Chinese government adopt. This leads to a problem of innovation, right? Therefore, oftentimes, even though Chinese brands are cheaper, your Chinese consumers themselves actually prefer foreign brands which are actually far more expensive, right? Because the thing about electric vehicle is not like a common good, right? It's not just about the price. It's also important to be reliable as well. That's why because you need to travel long distances and all those things. So it's not just about making it cheaper as well. So notice that even though Tesla started off as a luxury brand, that is the only way in which oftentimes electric vehicle can start off their industry by, right? Because that's the only way to make profits to start off. But notice that Tesla is still not making profit. And that's why there's a free market incentive, for instance, for Tesla to try to, for instance, push their market to be far cheaper. That's why, for instance, they actually make their battery in-house, right, recently, in order to make their battery far more cheaper and far more able to be adopted, right? So there's free market incentive, for instance, for your companies to make it far cheaper and far accessible for consumers. What happens on their side in the hand is that they rely on those subsidies to make it cheaper. That's why you don't actually get better battery technology by over-relying on those particular subsidies, by over-relying on aggressive measures to adopt those things. Because if they recognize and consider that the current technology is not ready yet, what they are doing is they are pushing up production when the core technology is not ready and not sustainable. And that means that it's very difficult for governments, you entrench current players in a way that's unsustainable, and therefore you do not allow other players to come in to have far more innovative ideas, and for instance, for them to drive out adoption that's far more sustainable. But before that, yes?
The point is on your side. Every car buyer still has an innate incentive to buy a car that runs on fuel, thereby leading to air pollution and ozone emission.
Yeah.
Why is that an acceptable trade-off?
Because the alternative is that they are either still unable to afford the electric vehicle, or they buy an electric vehicle that's unsustainable. That's the trade-off that we are willing to not agree with, right? So, in terms of, so I think the point is that they rely too much on social engineering rather than actual methods in which we can actually do this. So there are two conclusions from this. The first is the current market incentives are far better. Secondly, as what Pearson talked about in his speech, is that because the current technology is not ready yet, by aggressively pushing those things, you're dealing with consequences that you cannot control, right? So obviously things like the fact that current technology isn't environmentally friendly yet because they rely too much on unsustainable source. And secondly, because oftentimes this means that they say that you need to at least make the switch first. But what we claim is that the switch is already happening. And we think that oftentimes what these electric vehicle companies do is they brand themselves as premium and all those things. That means that at the very least, there's some level of market share and there's some level of entrance to the market before they drive down their costs in the future. So that's how the transition tends to work. And we think that's better than, for instance, artificially reducing the cost in this debate. So what is the second point that we'll talk about in this debate? The second point that I'm going to talk about in this debate is about poverty, right? And that's where I think Pearson gives you 3 reasons why those things are far more important, right? Because those are more important needs for the poor, they're often higher in the hierarchical needs. Oftentimes, these people depend, I think more importantly, the response from Dion was this. Dion is that, if you just raise tax a little bit, you will not get to a lot of people starving and all those things. Okay, maybe perhaps Pearson might exaggerated, but I think it's not that much of an exaggeration. Why is this so? Because currently a lot of poor people do rely, for instance, on vehicles to transport, right? They cannot just take public transport because a lot of public transport infrastructure is not that available and not that strong in a lot of those developing countries, right? They rely on, for instance, on diesel cars that are cheap to actually go to their job, for instance, to actually earn a living wage, right? Those are important concerns that you cannot dismiss as just a little bit of increase in taxes, right? Because if you agree, for instance, that the current technology is still nascent, in order to meet your current demands, you need to spend a lot of money to meet your current goals, right? So those are not just minimal tax increases. If you agree that the current technology is very nascent and the adoption is not high enough, in order to increase the adoption, you actually have to spend a lot of money, right? So those are not small amount of economic resources that you're actually spending. And likelihood, the amount of those resources that are spending will likely be forced upon the poor through increased diesel tax and all of those things. And oftentimes, these people are also unable to afford the electric vehicles that you are also taxing. So both vehicles become far more expensive. I mean, both vehicles become expensive for them, and therefore they are unable to, for instance, earn a living wage or find it far difficult to oftentimes actually make a good living for themselves. And this is more important because what we say is the current people matter too. While we agree that we had to move and transit towards a greener society, we say that we should not forget the people who are still vulnerable within our current society, right? So people, for instance, who rely on all of those diesel vehicles to transport. So we think that we have to make it easier for them to access those vehicles as well. What we suggest on our side, however, is that the current market is already making that fundamental shift towards electric vehicle anyways, right? And the current market incentives are actually far more convincing because of the incentive to innovate, to make their vehicles, for instance, far more to access, because all companies, in order to succeed in the long term, need to make their cars accessible to the middle income at the very least, right? So this free market incentive already exists. The comparative is, just increase the adoption, but don't increase the adoption in a sustainable way, in a way that actually allows for technology to improve at its own pace and that takes into account the problem that poor people actually face. Lastly, I want to point out the fact that these poor people are oftentimes the primary duty of the government to actually deal with, right? Future citizens don't have the right to vote. These people pay taxes, they put in their money into the economy, and these are people that matter too. We are very proud to oppose.
I thank the third opposition speaker for their speech. May I now call upon opposition reply speaker to deliver the reply speech.
Can I check if I can be heard? Three reasons why we win today's debate. First, a rapid and aggressive transition towards electric vehicles will not be one that's environmentally friendly. I think the main assumption undergirding the whole of the proposition case is that once we transition electric vehicles, all the problems of the world is solved. I don't think it's as simple as that, and I don't think they've responded to it as well. We told you about problems of infrastructure. That oftentimes, when we have an aggressive move towards it, we're not talking about 1, 2, 10 vehicles. We're talking about the entire country's vehicles suddenly transitioning onto using electricity. This is very likely to lead to a country to fire old power plants. They say, oh, but we can build infrastructure a lot later. There are problems with this, right? Building infrastructure a lot later is oftentimes not possible because think about how much money they're going to spend subsidizing these electric vehicles already. They are not like printing money all the time. Like they can't fiat that they can print money all the way, right? And I think there is a necessary trade-off that they have to deal with in this debate. Or sometimes these infrastructures just never are able to catch up because this infrastructure takes time. It doesn't magically appear in 2 or 3 years. And electricity infrastructure will take 10, 20 years to build, and that's 10, 20 years of pollution they still have to deal with on their side of the house. The second, and I don't think they responded to this, that electric vehicles today are still in their nascency. We haven't figured out how to make the battery itself, the most important component of electric vehicles, not pollute the environment. And a widespread adoption of it will only delay the problem of this because 20 years later, we might have lithium-ion leaks down the road. And I think those are problems that they have to deal with on their side. But most importantly, I don't think they proved to you how to get widespread adoption. The reason why is because of the argument they don't want to respond to, that these incentives entrench the current market players. That means that that means that these current market players increase in market power significantly. They're able to price everybody out in such a way that nobody can adopt it. They say, oh, but you have more competition. No, they themselves concede, right, that they have green patents. That patents necessarily lock out other companies, which means that widespread adoption will never be an end goal. For the first reason, I don't think they prove their environmental benefit. Why do we still prove ours? We told you that a gradual transition will be much better, and it's one that's very, very likely. The reason why is because of an increase in private capital that has made electric vehicles way more viable gradually. And that gradual move is one that does not place strain on the environment. So on the consideration of the environment, I think we win. The second issue then on the poor. So I think they've been incredibly unresponsive to this problem. They seem to be a government that's printing money whenever they want to. But if they want to have infrastructure, they want to have subsidies, then they necessarily have to take that money out from somewhere. And we posit to you that somewhere will be the poor, because they're the most likely to be impacted by tax revenue. They are the most dependent on it. Taking away money will impact them the most. The problem here is that if they have all of their policies, that necessarily means that school, healthcare can never be a consideration and a possibility for the poor. But if you have too little subsidies, then we posit to you that the transition for the poor will be extremely hard. They didn't say, oh, but healthcare costs, right? If we transition towards electric vehicles, healthcare costs will no longer be a problem. No. They assume that their infrastructure is clean. Insofar as I prove to you that the transition of the infrastructure will not be possible and viable, then I don't think they can claim this benefit of healthcare costs on their side. Why does this argument on the poor win us the round? I think they have been incredibly unresponsive to the two lines of principal analysis on why the poor is our winning argument here. The first is that states, governments have a duty to their citizens first and foremost. They pay taxes, they vote. The legitimacy of the state comes from its people. To that end, they have a moral duty to care for them in the most intimate way, and that means uplifting the poor first. But second, on the consideration of the hierarchy of needs as well, the poor needs things like healthcare, right? Needs things like schools. And to the extent that they have such an aggressive policy, they are very, very likely to cut money away from somewhere, and I posit that the somewhere is the poor. Governments have a duty towards the poor. So, in conclusion, the reason why we win this debate is because first, I don't think they prove to you the environmental benefits they actually get, and second, I don't think they deal with the immense amount of harms given they don't get any benefit on their side. Proud of host.
I thank the opposition reply speaker. May I now call upon the proposition reply speaker to deliver the reply speech for proposition.
With every second, every minute, every day, and then year that passes, is an increasing environmental cost coming from petrol-based cars. As every person moves out into the city, going to their workplaces, is another molecule of CO2 that goes into the air that we cannot easily retrieve. Ladies and gentlemen, the longer we employ a wait-and-see tactic, it's another child that dies from air pollution in the city, another family that permanently loses their primary means of sustenance because their crops become unviable due to climate change. We think that at the end of the day, the debate about the poor is one that looks at the poor and prioritizes their well-being not only now, but also their ability to succeed in the future. We do not think that this debate can be won based on simply allowing people to exist to a future that will not exist for them in the long run. So at the end of the day, we think there are three main clashes that win us this debate. First of all, what is the state of electric vehicles today? Are they viable for people to be using now? Second, are they going to be better in the future, and whether these things will be promoted to a point in which we have a more sustainable future as a whole, talking about the environmental impact. And lastly, who actually helps the poor in the long run and garners a greater benefit for them at the end of the day. So on this first idea about whether electric vehicles are viable today, right? We talked to you about why electric vehicles are structurally being gatekept from the common people because they are expensive, they are gatekept, and companies do not want to simply allow people to buy them because they profit more off of them being luxury goods, right? We think that what we do at the end of the day is that we achieve the goal of increased uptake because we tackle directly the idea of how they are a luxury good. They are only relegated for the richest echelons of society, right? We also argue that there's no net increase in production because the production of cars is something that is going to be kept consistent. People are not randomly going to be buying a second new car because of decreasing marginal utility, right? So get that. What we are doing is that we are gradually allowing the new generation of cars at a point which your old car does not work anymore to be a green one. What we do here is that when we talk about the environmental impact, right, is that we allow more people to justify buying the green car as compared to the past. What we think we do here is that even if technology and profitability is in its nascent state, which we don't actually argue for, we still think that we achieve the net zero outcome of mitigating air pollution and mitigating climate change. We think that this is our environmental achievement at the end of this debate and takeaway, right? So even if we want to agree with Pei Song that the environmental impact might be slightly more, we think that we need to gear towards a future where these things are far more common and seen as far more accessible by the common man. Second, are they going to be better in the future? We talked to you about how gatekeeping is a problem. And here's where we find that opposition's counterfactual is incredibly lacking, right? Because they tell us that a gradual change is going to happen. We talked to you about how structurally gradual change is something that cannot take place unless there's equal incentive for companies to move on beyond their existing policy of maximizing profit. We therefore told you why governments need to step in and manipulate how this profit incentive works so that more people are therefore going to be able to access these things in the future. We talked to you about economies of scale, why changing our production values is important, and why is this going to structurally solve the issues that prevent people from accessing these benefits in the status quo. We think that they never truly engage on this idea of gatekeeping, and they never talk to you about why gradual change is something that's possible in the status quo, given how strong these profit incentives already are. And therefore, we don't think that you can argue for gradual change without truly explaining how it actually works. Lastly, let's talk about the poor. We talked to you about how climate change is incredibly time sensitive. Therefore, the poor are the worst hit by climate change, and every second that you wait is another second a poor person is going to suffer because of the outcomes brought about by lack of action. We think that the best time for this policy was 50 years ago, but the second best time is now. So proud to propose. Thank you.
Okay, I thank the proposition reply speaker, and I thank all speakers for the robust debate. We've now come to the end of the debate.
Okay, thank you, teams, for that robust debate. May I invite the adjudicators to proceed to the reading room to deliberate the results. We will take a short break and be back at 3 o'clock. In the meantime, here are some videos for your viewing. Enjoy.
The way the world produces and uses energy is visibly changing. But to meet the most ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement, change needs to happen faster. Shell is becoming an energy business for the future, and it's playing its part to help drive that change. Our scenarios help inform our thinking and show how the energy system could transform quicker.
The transition of the world's energy system is happening while global population is growing, potentially to 11 billion by the end of the century. That's more people requiring more energy for a better quality of life.
So the question is, what could this energy system look like?
For the global economy to achieve net zero carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions, electricity, primarily from renewables, as well as hydrogen and biofuels, are expected to be important in the future energy system.
Shell scenarios explore a range of possible futures to help make better decisions today for tomorrow. Our newest scenarios, Waves, Islands, and Sky 1.5, are all on a path towards net zero CO2 emissions, with energy systems eventually dominated by renewables. But the choices society makes will determine how quickly the world moves towards net zero emissions.
In the most ambitious scenario, Sky 1.5, the average global temperature rises above and is then limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels before the end of this century. This requires the entire world to reach net zero CO2 emissions by sometime before 2060.
Our scenarios show that leading economies, sectors and companies must act faster for the world to achieve this timeline. And we want to be one of those leading companies, which is why Shell's target is to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner.
The Sky 1.5 scenario requires energy efficiency improvements of around 50% across the global economy. But more energy will still be needed to meet demand. So, the emerging system needs to address the economic sectors that consume the most energy. To get from today's energy consumption to a net zero emissions energy system, industry will need to shift towards more electricity, primarily from renewables, as well as hydrogen and bioenergy. Currently in transport, energy consumption is mostly from oil-based fuels. But the use of hydrogen and biofuels will need to grow, as will electricity, mainly from renewables. Today, buildings mostly consume energy from non-renewable sources. In the future, they will require electricity mostly from renewables, with some bioenergy.
Deep electrification of the global economy is needed to achieve net zero emissions, which means more than tripling electricity consumption.
In power generation, electricity will increasingly come from renewables, primarily wind and solar, as well as some nuclear. Natural gas will continue to play an important role, supporting the transition from coal and compensating for the intermittency of renewables.
Commercial production of biofuels from biomass must ramp up, alongside the production and distribution of hydrogen at scale.
To achieve Sky 1.5, unavoidable emissions are removed from industrial processes or from the atmosphere using both technology and nature.
While the energy transition is inevitable, it will proceed at different paces in different places and sectors and with different degrees of turbulence.
Faster progress needs pioneering leaders in government and businesses to act. Government policy and greater alignment will also be crucial, country by country and sector by sector, with each needing a different approach to unlock well-directed investment.
We know that the energy transition can only happen if governments and businesses incentivize low and zero carbon choices and if customers embrace these changes.
There is no doubt the transformation of the energy system must move faster to limit global warming. And this is a huge challenge that affects everyone because the world needs energy to improve lives. And for a healthy planet, this must be cleaner energy. Put simply, it is going to take ambitious orchestration of government policy, investment, and sector cooperation. But we believe the world can achieve net zero CO2 emissions to meet the goal of Paris if industry, government, and society work together to make the right choices now. The energy system must change faster, and change is opportunity. Shell is acting today to be part of this future.
Nanyang Technological University Singapore is embracing Industry 4.0 technologies on its smart campus to tackle many global issues. Besides being one of the most beautiful campuses in the world, NTU is also a living testbed for cutting-edge technologies and is set to be one of the most eco-friendly. It combines its research expertise with industries and the government for bigger breakthroughs and greater societal impact. The world's first full-size autonomous electric bus has undergone rigorous trials at the Center of Excellence for Testing and Research of Autonomous Vehicles at NTU, a unique testbed dedicated to piloting smart transportation technologies. NTU continues to integrate automation and robotics that aim to improve lives and industrial efficiencies. Digital transformation of the university extends in many different ways, from academic programs to learner-centered curricula to immersive technologies and communication. Various digital applications were also introduced to students, faculty, and staff for better administrative productivity and efficiencies. NTU is involved in every stage of the learning journey, from early childhood education to upskilling the workforce. Whilst technology is transforming the lives of people everywhere, NTU is also studying and mitigating any negative impact it may have on humanity. Climate change is one of Singapore's biggest threats. Harnessing the power of digital technology, NTU aims to achieve a 35% reduction in waste, water, and energy intensity by 2021. Supporting better living experiences, new discoveries, and resource sustainability. The NTU Smart Campus is a key pillar of Singapore's Smart Nation vision. Through its 200-hectare campus, NTU develops and testbeds emerging technologies that will transform the way we learn, work, and live.
Even though the world is going through uncertain times, we know there's an urgent need to tackle climate change. That's why, at Shell, our ambition is to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner. We aim to meet our customers' demand for cleaner energy, keeping in pace with society. But what does net zero emissions mean? It means change. It means the world working together to get as close to zero emissions as possible, and using technology and nature to address emissions that remain. Getting to net zero means change for Shell too. We aim to get there in 3 ways. Firstly, as an energy user, we aim to be net zero across all our operations. For example, a small Shell installation producing gas in the North Sea was the first of its kind to be powered by wind and solar energy. And our Shell-owned service stations in the UK are powered by renewable electricity. Secondly, as an energy provider, we aim to sell more lower carbon products. We already offer 100% renewable electricity for homes and businesses. We have hydrogen and fast electric vehicle charging points for cars. By selling products like these, we can help our customers reduce their carbon footprint. And finally, as a partner for change, we'll work with businesses, governments, and others to help sectors find their own path to net zero emissions. This means working together to find ways to encourage the use of cleaner fuels in planes, ships, and heavy-duty trucks. So our ambition means change. The business plans we have today will not get us there. So our business plans must change, as society and our customers also change. And by working together, we can achieve a net zero emissions world.
The way the world produces and uses energy is visibly changing. But to meet the most ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement, change needs to happen faster. Shell is becoming an energy business for the future, and it's playing its part to help drive that change. Our scenarios help inform our thinking and show how the energy system could transform quicker.
The transition of the world's energy system is happening while global population is growing, potentially to 11 billion by the end of the century. That's more people requiring more energy for a better quality of life.
So the question is, what could this energy system look like?
For the global global economy to achieve net zero carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions, electricity, primarily from renewables, as well as hydrogen and biofuels, are expected to be important in the future energy system.
Shell scenarios explore a range of possible futures to help make better decisions today for tomorrow. Our newest scenarios, Waves, Islands, and Sky 1.5, are all on a path towards net zero CO2 emissions, with energy systems eventually dominated by renewables. But the choices society makes will determine how quickly the world moves towards net zero emissions.
In the most ambitious scenario, Sky 1.5, the average global temperature rises above and is then limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels before the end of this century. This requires the entire world to reach net zero CO2 emissions by sometime before 2060.
Our scenarios show that leading economies, sectors and companies must act faster for the world to achieve this timeline. And we want to be one of those leading companies, which is why Shell's target is to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner.
The Sky 1.5 scenario requires energy efficiency improvements of around 50% across the global economy. But more energy will still be needed to meet demand. So, the emerging system needs to address the economic sectors that consume the most energy. To get from today's energy consumption to a net zero emissions energy system, industry will need to shift towards more electricity, primarily from renewables, as well as hydrogen and bioenergy. Currently in transport, energy consumption is mostly from oil-based fuels. But the use of hydrogen and biofuels will need to grow, as will electricity, mainly from renewables. Today, buildings mostly consume energy from non-renewable sources. In the future, they will require electricity mostly from renewables, with some bioenergy.
Deep electrification of the global economy is needed to achieve net zero emissions, which means more than tripling electricity consumption.
In power generation, electricity will increasingly come from renewables, primarily wind and solar, as well as some nuclear. Natural gas will continue to play an important role, supporting the transition from coal and compensating for the intermittency of renewables.
Commercial production of biofuels from biomass must ramp up, alongside the production and distribution of hydrogen at scale.
To achieve Sky 1.5, unavoidable emissions are removed.
Hi guys,
from
can everyone
industrial
please take your
processes
seats as
or
we
from
will
the
resume
atmosphere,
shortly.
using both technology and nature.
Hi guys, can everyone
While the
please
energy
take your
transition
seats?
is
We're about to
inevitable,
begin
It will
again.
proceed at different paces in different places and sectors, and with different degrees of turbulence.
Faster progress needs pioneering leaders in government and businesses to act. Government policy and greater alignment will also be crucial, country by country and sector by sector, with each needing a different approach to unlock well-directed investment.
We know that the energy transition can only happen if governments and businesses incentivize low and zero carbon choices, and if customers embrace these changes.
There is no doubt the transformation of the energy system must move faster to limit global warming. And this is a huge challenge that affects everyone, because the world needs energy to improve lives. And for a healthy planet, this must be cleaner energy. Put simply, it is going to take ambitious orchestration of government policy, investment, and sector cooperation. We believe the world can achieve net zero CO2 emissions to meet the goal of Paris. if industry, government and society work together to make the right choices now. The energy system must change faster, and change is opportunity. Shell is acting today to be part of this future.
Hi guys, we're starting soon, so please do take your seats. Where's your team members? Welcome back, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment we've all been waiting for. May I invite the Chief Adjudicator, President of Shell Eastern Trading, Mr. Leong Wei Hang, to give the final debrief. Mr. Leong Wei Hang, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. There's been a very, very intense debate session that we've had this morning, and obviously you've witnessed the finals as well, which has been well debated. Last week, we also had very debated motions in the preliminary rounds. I can see the quality of the teams that have come through, and thanks for all the participating teams for really engaging in the arguments, which are really real-world motions which the industry is struggling with. Just a little bit of today's debate. We thought there was very well argued on both sides. Both sides showed the reasons why their position would have been a stronger position, and also that the arguments for society would take several aspects to understand and work through, both from the availability, the technology, as well as the impact on society. And that was very well built up by both teams. Yeah? It was, I can tell you that in the room, it was a difficult decision, and there were really strong points for deciding one against the other. And the fact that both teams argued the positions very well, and there was a very healthy rebuttal of points that were made from the other teams, that made the debate richer and therefore more difficult for us. Yeah? There was a very healthy demonstration of the short-term needs to incentivize industry to grow and help people to change and get more adoption. But there's also a very good argument of the long-term trade-offs, the society, the health of people, what they need to live on, right? And that was very happy to see that that we are still thinking about how to position our trade-offs properly, and how to address this challenge. I'm very glad personally to see both teams were thinking about how society can benefit from the actions of today, and it's extremely important as we decide as a society what direction we take with some of the available technology and available capital that we have afforded to us, right? I think one team had a much deeper analysis of their points of argument, and that really swung the decision in that direction. I think there could have been a bit more evidence built on some of the arguments of how things would work in each of the worlds that we imagine. Time may be the limitation, but we thought we could have built a bit more on that could bring out the supporting elements to your argument. These are really real world dilemmas, and we found the debate very mature and very well developed. So I congratulate the teams in the finals, and thank you for the effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Leong Wei Hang. Now, it is my pleasure to invite the Dean, College of Business, Nanyang Business School, Professor Christina So, to present the prize to the best speaker. So the best speaker has demonstrated clear understanding of the core issues of the debate and created a strong response to defeat the arguments from the other speakers. The best speaker is Sia Pei Song from Team SMU. Thank you, Professor Christina. You may now return to your seat first. Now, may I invite the chairman of Shell Companies in Singapore, Ms. Aw Ka Ping, to present the prize to the first runner-up team. The first runner-up team of the Shell-NTU Inter-Varsity Energy Transition Debate Competition is Team NUS. Please come forward and claim your prize. Yeah, please stay on the stage, first runner-up. Okay, thank you. Next, may I once again invite Professor Christina to join Ms. Aw Ka Ping to present the prizes to our champion team. And our champion team for this Intervarsity debate competition is, you all guessed it, Team SMU. Congratulations. Congratulations, everyone. Thank you. Ms. Aw Ka Ping, could you please stay to deliver the closing remarks?
Yes. Hey. Well, congratulations, to the teams, both teams. Certainly to the winning team, SMU, and to the NUS team. What an amazing day it has been. Huh? The energy that we saw in this room, the tension You know, the focus, you know, that you bring to this debate has been totally amazing. And, you know, for those people who are joining us online, I wish you were here because if not for the COVID restrictions that we have today, I think your presence would have made this even more vibrant. But thank you, regardless of where you're joining us from, thank you for joining us. A seasoned debater once told me that, you know, a good debater, at least one of the attributes of a good debater, is that ability to listen in order to understand. Of course, I've never debated before, so it took a while for me to ponder what that meant, you know. And as I thought about that, you know, this ability to listen to understand started to make a lot of sense to me because, you know, in what we do today at Shell, dealing with the challenge of energy transition every single day, that ability to listen to understand is absolutely crucial because this is where we start to appreciate the diversity of views out there. We start to have empathy for the context that each of us is a part of that is different from the other person. We start to go deeper into why is it that way? And if we are really going to change, how are we going to change? Because we have to move forward together. We cannot move forward as one. So as I thought about that capability of good debaters, which all of you have shown in a remarkable way, that ability to listen to understand, then I congratulate all of you because you've shown us that not only do you have that ability, but you have the ability to then take that understanding and go further with it, right? To have a point of view and hopefully turn that point of view at some point into a bias for action. Now, at Shell, we talk a lot about bias for action because yes, we can debate, yes, we can analyze problems, opportunities. In the end, we have to act. And that is what we're doing for Shell in Singapore. We've been here, 130 years. NTU has been in Singapore for 30 years. So we are both institutions that are fully committed, not just to Singapore, but to its future. In our 130 years history, we've been a proud co-creator of Singapore's economic progress. Whatever we've done, whichever part of the Singapore energy system that we've been part of, we've been honored to build it with this country. Now, the question then becomes, what would that look like in future as we make energy transition a reality that Shell wants to thrive in? We don't want to just exist. We want to be a proud partner of Singapore in future. We've already started that journey. We've said that in every part of our business, we will make energy transition real. So we've started to divert what we do, move away from fossil. You've heard it. We're going to rebuild our business with more sustainable value chains, more circularity in our products, and we're going to help our customers to decarbonize, and we're going to work on the sectors that are important to Singapore and to Shell. So whether those sectors are aviation, shipping and maritime, power, we're going to work on all those important sectors. And we're going to do it with our partners. And who do we mean when we say partners? Of course, as a business, we have customers, but our partners encompass more than our customers. It encompasses the youth of the future, people like you sitting here today, universities, institutions of higher learning, the government, different segments of society. So when we say we want to partner for energy transition, it's not just about working with our customers. It's about working with this broad set of partners. So we're really very excited. I'm very excited to be in Shell at this moment so that I can participate at least for a certain period of time, in creating that next 130 years. Yeah? So thank you all for being part of this. But I want to thank a few people in particular who've helped to make this happen. Obviously, there's folks from our NTU colleagues and team. Yue Ting, Katharina, Sam, Joshua, Beatty, Brian, and of course, the judges. And then from the Shell side, Leanne, Philip, Siwen, wherever you're seated, over there, yeah, Ziwei, who are all here with us today. I think without your dedication of the past many months, this simply would not have happened. So thank you so much for believing in the power of these debates. And I would invite all of you, as you go back, share the good news with your family, enjoy the rest of the weekend. Don't just be part of the debate, be part of the action. And we hope you will consider being part of that action with Shell. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ong Kaping. We've come to the end of our debate competition. Thank you so much, everyone. This is Leanne signing out.